I'm Dr. Flux, and welcome back to General Psychology. We are in the second lecture of our sixth module about sensation and perception. In our last lecture, we uncovered how sensation and perception work together to shape our experience of the world. We learned that sensation is the raw data that your body collects, while perception is how your brain interprets that data to build a model of reality. But not all senses are created equal. For most of us, as humans, vision is the dominant sense. It's how we navigate the world, recognize faces, read emotions, and avoid walking into walls. That makes vision a perfect model system for understanding sensory processing. So today, we're taking a deep dive into the visual system. How does your eyes collect light? How does your brain process that information? And how is your perception of the world, in many ways, a beautifully crafted visual illusion? But before we jump into today's material, let's do a quick check-in from our last lecture. Which process involves the initial signal encoding from sensory organs? Is it A, sensation, B, perception, C, reflex, or D, adaptation? If you said A, sensation, you're spot on. Sensation is the initial encoding of that raw sensory data. Perception is how the brain turns it into something meaningful. Which of the following is not an example of Gestalt processing? Is it A, generality, B, proximity, C, figure ground, or D, closure? If you chose A, you got it. Generality is not one of the different types of Gestalt processing that we discussed in the previous lecture. Today we're focusing on vision because it is a perfect model to understand how the brain processes sensory information. Think about it. Light enters your eye as raw data, but what you see isn't just a reflection of that light. Your brain's model of the visual world isn't a perfect snapshot of reality. It's filled with assumptions, shortcuts, and errors from time to time, but it's still useful. It helps you to navigate, recognize, and interface with your environment. Here's a roadmap of what we'll be looking at today. We'll start with the anatomy of the eye, how light enters your eyes and becomes a signal your brain can understand. Then we'll explore color vision, how we see the full spectrum and why some people perceive color a bit differently. We'll take a look at depth perception, how your brain creates a 3D model of the world from 2D images. And finally, we'll uncover how the visual cortex processes all this information to build your visual experience. Then we'll wrap up with our conclusion and a bit of review. By the end of this lecture, you'll see how vision isn't just about seeing. It's about how your brain builds a model of reality, even when the data is incomplete. To understand how we see, we need to start with the eye itself, the small, complex organ that takes in light and begins the process of turning it into something meaningful. Here's how light travels through your eye, and we'll go over some of the main anatomical features of this organ. Light first hits the cornea, that clear protective layer on the front of your eye. The cornea controls how light enters the eye. That light then passes through the aqueous humor, the clear liquid in the front part of your eye that keeps it nourished and inflated. The iris regulates the amount of light that enters into the eye. Then the light passes through the pupil, that dark circle in the center. The pupil adjusts its size depending on how much light is present, kind of like the aperture of a camera. Next, the light reaches the lens, which fine-tunes the focus by changing shape, a process called accommodation. This lens is adjusted by the ciliary muscle. Light then passes through the vitreous body, a gel-like substance between the lens and the retina. Finally, it lands on the retina, that light-sensitive layer at the back of your eye. This is where light is translated into an electrical signal that your brain can interpret. The fovea is the area of the retina with the highest visual acuity. The optic disc is the entry point of the optic nerve, and this is the one area of the retina where there are no light receptors, making it the position of that blind spot we talked about in the previous lecture. The encoded visual signal from the retina then travels into the brain through the optic nerve. Now, the retina is lined with photoreceptors. These are specialized cells that detect light and convert it into neural signals. Rods are responsible for detecting light and dark. They're super sensitive, which makes them perfect for night vision, but they don't pick up color, and that's why everything looks a bit gray in the dark. Cones, on the other hand, detect color and fine details, but they need bright light to work properly. They're most densely packed in the fovea, the center of your visual field. This is why you see the sharpest detail when you're looking directly at something. Together, rods and cones gather the raw visual data that your brain needs to create an image. But here's the thing, that data is incomplete, and your brain often has to step in to fill in the blanks. This is an example that we discussed in the last lecture in terms of the blind spot. Let's take a look at that blind spot a bit more closely. It's the point at which the optic nerve connects to the retina, so there's no photoreceptors here. That means that there's this small part of your visual fields where your eye doesn't collect any information, but we don't see it. There's no black hole in our vision because the brain fills in the gaps. It uses information from the surrounding areas of the retina to help to create a seamless image. This is a great example of how your brain's model of reality isn't just based on what you see. It's also based off of assumptions, computations, and predictions. Let's do a quick attention check. Which part of the eye contains the photoreceptors that detect light? Is it A, the cornea, B, the retina, C, the optic nerve, or D, the iris? If you picked B, the retina, you've got it. The retina is where rods and cones detect light and start the process of turning it into something that your brain can understand. Let's talk about one of the most vibrant parts of your visual experience, color. Now, you might think color is just out there in the world, but color doesn't exist in the environment. It's something that our brain creates based on how it interprets the reflection of different wavelengths of light. Let's break down the science behind color perception. Light is made up of electromagnetic waves. These waves come in different wavelengths, and your eyes are sensitive to just a small slice of this spectrum. That's the part that we call visible light. Short wavelengths create blue and violet colors. Medium wavelengths give us green, and long wavelengths produce red. But here's the kicker. These wavelengths are just data. It's your brain that interprets them as color. So how does our brain turn light into color? Enter trichromatic theory. Your retina contains 3 different types of cones that are sensitive to different wavelengths of light. The S cones respond to short wavelengths, which is perceived as blue. The M cones respond to medium wavelengths, which give us green, and the L cones respond to long wavelengths, which are seen as red. Your brain mixes signals from these cones, kind of like a painter blending primary colors, and that creates every shade that you see in the world. But color perception doesn't quite stop there. To fully understand how we see color, we need to bring in opponent process theory. This theory says that your brain processes color in opposing pairs. Red versus green, blue versus yellow, black versus white. When you stimulate one color in this pair, the other gets inhibited. This explains why you don't see reddish-green or bluish-yellow. Your brain doesn't really allow it. But it's also why you experience those after images we spoke about in the last lecture. If you stare at a green image for a while, your green cones get fatigued. And when you look away, your brain temporarily overcompensates, and you see a red after image. Now let's talk about when the brain's color model doesn't quite work as expected in the context of color blindness. Color blindness happens when one or more types of cones are missing or not functioning properly. The most common form is red-green color blindness, where people have trouble distinguishing between reds and greens. This covers 2 conditions: deuteranopia, the loss of L cones, and protanopia, the loss of M cones. A more rare kind of color blindness is tritanopia, which makes it difficult to distinguish between blue and yellow. But here's what's fascinating. People with color blindness aren't necessarily seeing a broken world. They're just experiencing a different model of reality that's based on the sensory information that their eyes provide. It's another reminder of that quote, how all models are wrong but some are useful. Your perception of color is just one version of reality. It's useful, but it's not the only way to experience the world. This brings up a big idea. Color isn't something that exists in the world. It's a perceptual experience that your brain creates based off of wavelengths of light that your eyes detect. Your brain is taking that raw data, adding context, making assumptions, and then constructing the colorful world that you see around you. Now, let's take a moment to reflect. How does color shape your experience of the world? Think of how certain colors can affect your mood, like how a bright sunny day feels different from a gray overcast one. Or consider how lighting changes the way color appears. A white shirt under fluorescent light might look blue, but under a warm light it might look yellow. What does that tell you about how much your brain influences what you see? It's a powerful reminder that color isn't something you passively perceive. something your brain actively constructs. All right, let's talk about something we usually take for granted, our ability to see the world in 3 dimensions. Here's a puzzle for you. Your eyes seem a little like cameras. They each capture a 2-dimensional image of the world. So how do we perceive depth, the distance between objects, or how far away something is? That's where depth perception comes in. It's your brain's way of building a 3D model of the world from flat images. And like everything we've talked about so far, this process isn't flawless, but it's incredibly useful. Even if you close one eye, you can still perceive depth. That's thanks to monocular cues. These are clues that your brain uses to judge distance with just one eye. It includes phenomena like relative size. If 2 objects are similar in size, the one object that looks smaller appears farther away. Think about looking down a street. Cars in the distance look tiny even though they're actually the same size as the car next to you. Another monocular clue is interposition. That's when one object overlaps another. Your brain assumes that the overlapping object is closer. For example, if a tree is partially blocking a house, you know that the tree is likely in front. Another component of monocular perspective is linear perspective. Parallel lines, like railroad tracks, seem to converge in the distance. Your brain interprets that convergence as depth. Finally, we have texture gradient. Surfaces that are close show more texture and detail. As objects move farther away, their texture becomes finer and less distinct. All right, now let's add in the second eye. Binocular cues come from the slight difference between what your left and right eyes see. This includes retinal disparity. Each of your eyes sees the world from a slightly different angle. The closer an object is, the greater the distance, or the disparity between the images. Your brain compares these 2 images to figure out how far away something is. We also have convergence. This is when you're looking at something close to your face, your eyes naturally turn inward to focus on them. The more your eyes converge, the closer the object is. That's why your eyes feel strained if you try to focus on something right at the tip of your nose. But here's the catch. Depth perception isn't foolproof. Sometimes your brain's assumptions can lead you astray, creating visual illusions. Forced perspective is often used in places like Disneyland, where the size of higher elements on Sleeping Beauty's castle are made smaller to give it the illusion that it's taller than it actually is. In our last lecture, we discussed the Ames room. This is a specially designed room that messes with your depth perception. One corner is closer to you than the other, but the room is built to look normal. When people stand in different parts of the room, your brain then thinks that they're growing or shrinking in size, even though they're the same. We also have the Ponzo illusion. Imagine 2 horizontal lines on a background with converging lines, like train tracks. Even though the lines that we're seeing in this image are the same size, the one that's higher up appears larger because your brain interprets it as being farther away. These illusions demonstrate the underlying computations that your brain is doing to understand the world around you. It's actively interpreting and constructing what you see. Let's do a quick attention check. Which of the following is a binocular cue for depth perception? Is it A, linear perspective, B, texture gradient, C, retinal disparity, or D, interposition? If you picked C, retinal disparity, you're on point. Binocular cues rely on information from both eyes, and retinal disparity is all about comparing the slightly different images each eye sees to judge depth. So far, we've talked about how light enters your eye and how your brain interprets color in depth, but all of this is just the beginning. The real magic is happening in the visual cortex, the part of your brain that takes raw visual data and transforms it into the detailed, colorful, 3-dimensional world that you see. Once light is converted into an electrical signal in the retina, those signals then need to get to your brain. The signal travels along the optic nerve from each eye. At the optic chiasm, some of the nerve fibers cross over. This means that the left visual field from both eyes goes to the right hemisphere, and the right visual field from both eyes goes to the left hemisphere. Finally, the signals reach the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe, right at the back of your brain. This is where the raw data starts to take shape into perception. In the primary visual cortex, the brain starts to process the basic features of what you see. You have specialized neurons called feature detectors that respond to specific elements of the visual scene. Some of these detect the orientation of lines, whether they're horizontal, vertical, or diagonal. Other neurons focus on contrast, the relative brightness between two areas. Some neurons respond to luminance, recognizing absolute brightness. Your brain pieces together these individual elements to form a coherent image. It's like assembling a puzzle. Each piece is simple on its own, but together they help to form a full picture. But the story doesn't end in the occipital lobe. Once your brain processes the basic features, it sends information along two different pathways. The ventral stream, or ventral pathway, also known as the what pathway, travels to the temporal lobe. This pathway helps you recognize objects, shapes, and faces. It's what allows you to look at a cup and instantly know it's a cup, or to recognize your best friend's face in a crowd. The dorsal stream, or dorsal pathway, is the where pathway, and it goes to the parietal lobe. This pathway helps you understand where things are in space and how they're moving. It's what lets you catch a ball, or avoid obstacles, or navigate through a crowded room. Together, these pathways help you to build a complete, dynamic understanding of your visual world. Damage to specific areas of the visual cortex can interfere with visual perception in some odd ways. Take blind sight, for example. It's a condition where individuals have damage to the visual cortex, but can still respond to visual stimuli without consciously seeing things. They can navigate obstacles or guess the direction of movement, even though they have no awareness of seeing anything. Another condition impacted by damage to the visual cortex is motion blindness, or achinotopsia. Imagine seeing the world not as a smooth, continuous flow, but as a series of frozen snapshots. That's what happens with motion blindness. People with this condition can see static objects just fine, but when something starts to move, it disappears, or it appears to jump from one place to another, kind of like a strobe light effect. Simple tasks become incredibly challenging. Imagine trying to pour coffee into a cup. Instead of seeing the liquid rise gradually, a person with motion blindness would only realize that the cup is full when it suddenly starts to overflow. Crossing the street can become dangerous. Cars might seem far away in one moment, but the next they're right in front of you. This condition highlights how essential motion perception is to our everyday life. It's not just about recognizing what we're seeing, but it's also about how understanding how things are moving in relation to us. So what have we learned about vision today? Let's break it down. The eye is where it all begins. Light enters, hits the retina, and is converted into signals by rods and cones. Your brain takes that data and constructs color based on the wavelengths of light, but also on context. That's why the same color can look different depending on the lighting of the surroundings. When it comes to depth perception, your eye uses clues from both eyes and the environment to build a 3D model of the world. But as we saw with visual illusions like the Ames room, that model can be tricked. The visual cortex is where all the pieces come together. Lines, edges, motion, faces, they're all processed and assembled into a cohesive image. And when something in that system breaks down, like in motion blindness, it reveals just how much work your brain is doing behind the scenes to create that seamless visual world. Vision shows us that perception isn't just about receiving information. It's about interpreting and constructing reality to help us to navigate the world. And of course, this brings us back to our guiding idea. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Your brain's visual model isn't perfect. It makes assumptions, it fills in gaps, and sometimes it gets it wrong. But it's still useful. It helps us to make sense of an ever-changing world in flux. Before we wrap up, here's a couple review questions to get you thinking. Which part of the brain is primarily responsible for processing visual information? Is it A, the temporal lobe, B, the occipital lobe, C, the parietal lobe, or D, the frontal lobe? If you said B, the occipital lobe, you nailed it. That's where primary visual cortex lives, the part of your brain that turns that raw data from the retina into detailed images that you see. Which theory explains how we perceive color using red, green, and blue cones? Is it A, trichromatic theory, B, opponent processing theory, C, depth perception theory, or D, Gestalt theory? The answer here is A, trichromatic theory. This theory explains how your brain uses input from 3 different types of cones, sensitive to red, green, and blue light, to create the full spectrum of colors that we perceive. Our visual experience isn't a fixed snapshot of the world. It's not like a camera. It's a dynamic, ever-changing interpretation shaped by your brain's predictions and assumptions. The more we understand how vision works, the more we realize that perception itself is in flux. It's not just about what's out there. It's about how your brain constructs meaning from the sensory data it receives. So as you move through the world, remember what you see is just one version of reality, built by your brain to help you navigate, connect, and create. So for now, stay curious, stay resilient, and above all, live life in flux. I'll see you in the next lecture.